everybody, praise be Jesus Christ. Welcome to episode 18 of CarmelCast. CarmelCast is a production of the Institute of Carmelite Studies Publications. Please visit us on the web at icspublications.org. And so we continue our Lenten theme of along the path of St. Thérèse of Lisieux. And as I have with previous weeks, I have a little pop quiz question for everybody to chime in. So this week's little question, and as you answer the question, you can introduce yourself as well. But this week's question is, what about St. Thérèse's message, her spirituality, her life, do you most identify with, or that you have found the most spiritual fruit from acquiring into your own spiritual life?
Yeah, that's a big question.
Yeah, that's quite a pop question. Thinking.
Maybe you should answer first, Brother Pier Giorgio.
Yeah.
That way we have a little time to think about it.
Well, okay, so for me, I'm Brother Pier Giorgio of Christ the King, and I think an aspect of her spirituality that is so helpful to me is her message of confidence in what God has done for us. Because so often in the spiritual life, there can be a tendency, and it was a tendency for Thérèse as well, to be somewhat scrupulous in terms of are we pleasing God at every moment. And her message of confidence, I think, resonates with me in the sense that I have to remember that the many ways that God has already given me His grace, and that He's gotten me this far. And I have to be confident that He's going to complete the work that He's begun in me, in my spiritual development, in my spiritual life. And I think I really have gotten a lot from Thérèse, Saint Thérèse's message of confidence in helping me in that regard. So for me, it's the message of confidence.
Yeah, I think I could jump off that because it's very similar for me as well. I think, and even before I entered the seminary or was following my vocation journey, it was easy to get discouraged and just seeing your own habitual imperfections can be heavy at times, and sometimes they look worse maybe than they even are, but regardless, that's how you experience it. And so I remember just getting discouraged about even the possibility of being holy or following this kind of call, and reading the story of a soul. It was just that confidence that no, the more I see my imperfections, the more I trust that God's power will work through me. And I think it's that kind of formula almost, is the more drawn we are to discouragement that I am, the more I can then trust and be encouraged that God is the one doing it. So that's helped me for almost 20 years. I stay with that. So.
Thank you, Father Michael Joseph of St. Thérèse.
Yeah, your title is of St. Thérèse,
that's
so
true, yeah.
You can tell that.
Sorry, I had to interrupt because you forgot to introduce yourself.
I could tell that you were upset by something.
I was like, what's his problem? Carmelites aren't known for following directions.
Yeah, we kind of just blow where the Spirit goes.
Well, my name is Brother John Mary of Jesus Crucified. And I would say for me, what really resonates with me about St. Thérèse's message is the simpleness of finding God's grace and opportunities for growth in the little things in our lives, every little thing. So it's not that we have to be in these great extraordinary circumstances to become saints, to become holy, but it's our interior disposition in the simple moments of our lives, the daily just struggles or even joys of our lives. And those are the kind of the playing field that God has given us to transform us into saints. And Thérèse definitely saw that in her life. She didn't have to go out to do all these incredible things in the eyes of the world to become a saint, but she just had to live faithfully in the simple ways within her cloister, loving her sisters and doing all that she could to give glory to God.
Well, Brother John Mary, you win the prize of helping me segue into the theme of this episode.
All right.
So your prize is this relic of St. Thérèse can be on your side of the table.
Oh,
wow.
So she's with you right now for this episode.
interesting.
Well, so the segue that I wanted that it was interrupted by my giving you that relic, is that so today's episode is going to be on St. Thérèse's discovery of the little way. And Father Michael Joseph has graciously offered to lead us in this discussion, and has prepared for us a great sort of road map of our discussion today. So we're grateful Father Michael Joseph for doing that for us, and you can go ahead and begin and get us started.
Well, yeah, we'll be grateful after. We'll see how it turns out. But I think just like anything with Thérèse's life, again, there's so much, and so the hard thing is boiling it down. And she was so simple, that she kind of boiled it down, but it's just so vast of how you can apply it. But I think it sort of ties in with what we were talking before of like her time, in her family, her time of discernment, entering the convent. And so this kind of sums up her life in the convent too. So as we're going through her life in a way and her message, they kind of become one at this point. Because this was, she ended up discovering her path, kind of her way that we know as the little way. And not just the little way, people call it, or she called it, the way of spiritual childhood, the way of confidence and love. So different ways you can kind of put it, but all sort of the same thing. And it was basically her path in Carmel towards the Lord. And so I think just kind of seeing it, tying it in with her life can be helpful. So I don't know, maybe you guys, can share a little bit about the background of, how the little way would have been discovered, and in the contrast maybe to the little way that she was living, in Carmel.
Well, I think it's something that many religious can relate to, is that first entry into religious life, and a purification occurs of what my expectations are going to be of my life as a religious, and maybe the reality, because in reality it takes the whole period of time of my life that I've sort of given over to proceeding in this way, in a Carmelite monastery. So when she arrived, when we all arrive into the monastery, we're confronted with the existence of the monastery as it is, the context in which all of these people who come together, who are all very different. There's not one Carmelite who's like the next. And that's really one of the beauties of religious life and community life, is this mix of characters and personalities and spiritual lives. How we relate to God is all different. So when she comes into Carmel, when she enters, when she's at this point she's 15, she's expecting, I think, a lot from her sisters in terms of what she wants to emulate, and it's tough for her, right? She doesn't really know how to make some of the severe penances really work for her, in terms of mortifications and real corporeal sort of mortifications in that sense. So she's struggling with that, and she really doesn't feel like it's working for her, or she's called to it. And I think from that sort of contrast, that purification of what mortification looks like, is where she sort of begins her journey with this discovery that she makes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and all this is taking place within the Jansenism that existed in France at that time, which is kind of this overemphasis perhaps on God's justice or God's punishment. There's this almost a fear of God that's rampant in the whole culture. We see a lot in reading about Thérèse's life, how she experienced, I think before her first communion or before her confirmation, one of those, she had a retreat where the priest was just talking about, the fear of hell and all these things to these little girls, and just like how scarring that could be for many of them. And of course, we can go the other way too. You could not talk about those things which are realities, but at her time especially, there was not a great understanding of God's love and mercy, and the focus instead was kind of on judgment and being scrupulous about every little act and being your sins and things like that. So Thérèse is entering in that context, and I almost wonder if, especially within the Carmel, there was the focus on the mortification, the penances, like a lot of fasting and I don't know what other practices they had, but different mortifications that involved kind of physical pain. And Thérèse was already kind of sickly from her youth, and so I wonder if like part of her discovery perhaps even could have been that she wasn't really capable of these things. Or she was already very weak, and so just taking on those things actually just harmed her and hurt her growth rather than helped. And so she realized very quickly, like, this isn't my way. And it doesn't mean she despised those who'd had these practices. She looked up to them. But she saw that, like, that wasn't her way of growth.
Yeah. I think that's an important point too, is that she respected these sisters, and like you said, looked up to them. Even there was a real sense that sanctity, when you looked at the lives of the saints back then, it was the extraordinary things that they did. That's what kind of set them apart from the ordinary Christian, So it was like, this saint had these ecstasies or this kind of prayer, or levitated, or, fasted for 30 days and didn't eat anything. And so it was like, those were the things that were promoted. So when you think about seeking sanctity, it was like, what can I do kind of extra almost for God? And I think that was, very much in the culture, even if it wasn't like look crazy all the time, maybe, or, but it was very much in the mentality of like doing something extra. And it's kind of like, I'm a Carmelite, so I need to sort of do this for the sake of those who don't do it. And so there was a kind of almost like a pressure, to like take on certain things that, as you said, she knew, like, this is not me though, this sort of path of the extraordinary kind of, flashy, maybe more things is not for me.
Yeah, and at the time in France, there was this, I think in the Carmels in France too, you see this in different testimonies from the time, but the spirituality of victimhood, like you mentioned, I have to the Carmelite nun living in the what's considered the most austere female religious order for the nuns, the cloistered convent. This idea that I have to mortify myself for the sake of the sanctity of humanity in order to sort of appease God's justice. This was a prevalent spirituality at the time, and I think it's one that Thérèse identified with in a sense, that she did feel like she was entering Carmel for the sake of others and for the sake of their redemption and the sake of their souls, but at the same time she wanted to do that in a way that worked for her and that was complementary with who she was as a young woman.
Yes, and I think that did, in a sense, justice to God's mercy, because with that mentality, it ends up emphasizing justice so much that you almost lose sight of, like, what does divine mercy even mean, And so through her own personal discernment, she helped open up an avenue, we could say, for the whole church to discover more deeply that God is merciful love. So it's kind of amazing how he used, her own discernment to come to this. So maybe I could just read a little quote from Story of a Soul where she talks about this, this kind of fruit in a sense of coming to see who God is himself. Like, if we look at the little way, it has to start with God. Like, who is God? And you have to almost get that right first before you can follow the little way. So she says, I understand, however, that all souls cannot be the same, that it is necessary there be different types in order to honor each of God's perfections in a particular way. To me, he has granted his infinite mercy, and through it, I contemplate and adore the other divine perfections. All of these perfections appear to be resplendent with love, even his justice, and perhaps this even more so than the others, seems to me clothed in love. What a sweet joy it is to think that God is just, that he takes into account our weakness, that he is perfectly aware of our fragile nature. What should I fear then? And so, it was like seeing everything through the lens of God as love, and how that is at the foundation of the little way. But again, it took time, it took time to discover that. It took a lot of prayer. Can we see in her life, like, certain episodes that kind of led, or what was the kind of some turning point to lead her to really discover the little way?
Yeah, we talked, I think, it might have been the last episode when we were talking, or maybe the one before, we talked about her Christmas grace. And I think we even said in that episode that this was really, I forget what word we used, but we said, like, this was kind of, at least the roots of the little way were found in that experience. And it was her having this experience of her own weakness, her own inability, and yet God's grace kind of breaking through, God's mercy, God's love breaking through in her life and doing the work for her.
Yeah, it's like this discovery of how we cooperate with God's grace, and and how much he does with so little of what we do, just to walk alongside with what he's doing and to accept what he's doing in our life. I think that's really kind of the grace she received in that moment of her Christmas conversion.
Yeah, because it's hard too. You know, she had such strong desires. That was one of the things. You know, and she was raised. Thank God, you know, her sisters had good common sense, and they had the spirituality of St. Francis de Sales, because of their own education and their nun who was a visiting sister. That she had, you know, so she had a good foundation of like a reasonable spirituality in a sense. Because I think if she didn't, she could have been a mess, because she had such strong desires for holiness, to be close to God, this kind of sensitivity towards God's being displeased with her, you know, that it's like, what do you do with that? You know, you have these desires, and then you face against the reality of your own weakness, you know, and that's where the kind of the crucible is of the little way. And those are the two things we can't forget. Like, you know, some people, I think maybe they think the little way is kind of mediocrity or laziness or kind of excuse to not, like, I don't need to fast, you know, I'm doing the little way or something. And that's because if you don't have a strong desire for holiness and for God, maybe it's not always a felt desire, you know, you can't say you're going to always be like, you know, burning with it or something, but a real deep sense of what you want in terms of holiness, then you can't really follow it in a sense, because that was the tension for her, you know, that kind of led her on her path. I heard once a definition of it it always stuck with me, is that the little way is the infinity of desire within total powerlessness. And so how do you sort of, you know, get that in the right direction? You know, what do you do with that desire? And so maybe we could speak a little bit about that. Like, how did she sort of solve that tension in a way, or at least use that tension to get her where she needed to be?
Yeah, I like what you said about that idea of infinite desire. It was like this really, this intense and strong desire. And I remember the quotation of Thérèse of Avila, where she says, the measure which you desire him, you will find him. And that just gives me so much confidence always. And again, like you said, desire is not always like this like felt fire, but there is some kind of constancy in our desire for God. And Thérèse had such a strong desire that especially when she looked, I think, at the lives of the saints, she saw, like, she wanted to be a martyr. She wanted, you know, she wanted to live the life of a missionary. Like, she saw all these great ways to give glory to God, and she had strong desires to love God, and to serve him in those ways.
I think we talked in the first season a lot about the importance of desire. I'm having flashbacks to that conversation, but this idea of determination in the context of our struggles, our daily struggles, and how much it is desire that constantly brings us back. And it's not something that comes, I mean, it is within ourselves, but it's something that comes from God. He puts this desire for himself within us. It's the life of the Trinity that is in us through the grace of our baptism.
Right. And then that crucible that you were talking about is, so if what happens when we have this really strong desire to do all these things to serve God, but then also we're weak and we can't do them. I have this memory of when I was young, I think it was around September 11th, I was in 5th grade, and you know, you're hearing about all these horrible things that are happening, and I had this strong desire to do something, to help, to change the world, you know, but I was in 5th grade and I felt very limited. It's like, well, what can I do? I'm just a kid. And I think that's kind of what Thérèse is experiencing, the strong desires to make a difference, but then also realizing her own limitations and weakness. And then it's from those two things clashing that we see kind of the little way coming forward.
Yes.
We talked about this part of her life, you know, when she's going through the process of trying to enter Carmel, but really the first sort of manifestation for her was this taking under her wings, her prayer wings, Pranzini, this convicted criminal. She wanted to make a difference in his life, to pray for him, as that, with that idea of a victim soul, making small sacrifices for someone's conversion. So you see that really in a small way very early on after her Christmas conversion.
Yeah. And it was all, yeah, it was kind of like everything was pointing her to the little way, you know, before, and kind of leading into that direction. It all sort of gets summed up in it, because it's this, a real sense too. I'll just read this quote from the last conversations. We can never have too much confidence in God, who is so powerful and merciful. We obtain from him as much as we hope for. So yeah, like this hope that this convicted criminal, you know, who she's just reading about in the newspaper, who the whole, you know, France is jeering at, this is that she could make that difference in his life. And yet she had this confidence that she would, and it worked, you know. And I think that's the cool thing for us, kind of on the other side of it, is that the confidence was well repaid. That her confidence really did obtain everything she sought, you know. And how that has to be so fundamental to our practice of the little way is just that total confidence that God can do this and he will do it.
Right. Yeah, and that's the trick too, is that it's God that does it. And so that's where we see, it's not that Thérèse said, well, despite my weakness, it's actually because of my weakness, I can't do these things. Therefore, God will bring them about, because God won't give me a desire unless he will fulfill it.
Yes.
And so there's actually a danger in, you know, if we rely on ourselves or don't focus on our weakness, that we're very limited in that sense, because you can only do what you're capable of. Yeah. Even if that's great in the eyes of the world, that's not enough. And so it's only by realizing that we can't do it ourselves, and that's in allowing God to be the one.
And she recognized too in the lives of the saints that this desire existed on all, you know, manifold levels of capability. One saint that was she was very devoted to was Théophane Vénard, who was a missionary in Indochina, and she recognized within herself as a similarity with Théophane this great desire, but for herself as a cloistered nun and him as a missionary, this difference of what God has called us to. So even though, you know, some may have a more active role in bringing about change in the world, we all have, it all comes from the same place. Yes. And God is calling each according to his or her gifts that he's already given to us. Yes. And for some that's in austere contemplative life, and for some it's the life of a missionary.
And I think that's a great tie-in too to the way that we see how the little way is so universal. You know, that was part of the brilliance of her insight, is that she found it as her path in Carmel, but it was also the path of someone who was a missionary. It's the path of a young mom, you know, struggling to get her, you know, kids all together, getting them to mass, and the dad who's, you know, working and trying to like live, even though he doesn't have a ton of time for prayer maybe. And it's like, so you can see how it's something that's universal, you know, that can really, whatever form of life you're in, you can live it. And I just want to read a little quote that I think is very consoling. It was actually a letter to her sister, but when talking about what God is looking for in terms of, you know, what he's looking for in the soul, she says, "What pleases him is that he sees me loving my littleness and my poverty, the blind hope that I have in his mercy. That is my only treasure. Why would this treasure not be yours?" And she says, "Understand that to love Jesus, to be his victim of love, the weaker one is, without desires or virtues, the more suited one is for the working of this consuming and transforming love." I think one of the misconstrued notions of the little way is always to focus on the works, right? Doing little things, which is great. I mean, it's very essential. But we've talked about now kind of the attitude, which I think is probably more at the fundamental of like, what is the little way? This attitude of confidence, trust, despite whatever we see in ourselves or with whatever we see in ourselves. But then the works are very important, you know, and it's a real completion of that attitude of childlike confidence and trust. So what, maybe you could share, what are the aspects, how do works kind of come into play in all this?
Well, I think, you know, whenever we have an understanding that comes through grace in our prayer life, there's this desire of wanting to act upon it. So from the heart of prayer comes, you know, from the desire that we have for God in a relationship with him, comes a further desire to manifest that love in the world, and to be charitable to those whom God has put into our life. And for Thérèse, that was a huge part of what she wanted to do with this little way, was to take advantage of the little opportunities that would come to her throughout the day, to show her love and her that she was cooperating with God's grace in the moments that she had within the context of the monastery.
Conrad de Meester, in his book With Empty Hands, which I think ICS sells,
Mm-hmm.
right? I think, I mean, in my opinion, that's kind of the best synthesis of Therese's like spiritual teaching.
Mm-hmm.
He does such a great job, but yeah, With Empty Hands, he talks about this. It almost seems often like Thérèse is contradicting herself when she talks. So often she'll talk about it. You know, it's not about the works, and our works are nothing. And then at other times she says, "But I have to have works," and then she'll focus on those things. And so he kind of talks a little bit about, the two sides of that. And that's really, I think, it's such a mystery of grace, is how, how is it that we participate with God's grace? So it's really God who's working, but yet we participate. So there's something that we're doing as well. And but there's a quote in there, I think from that Celine recalls from Therese's life, where she says that her way is not one of just like this passive like inactivity. And so there's this insistence that yes, we have to do something, and that's what I think that you're talking about this. What is it? What's the work? And like you said, I think a lot of it is the little ways that are presented to us in our life of loving those. And Thérèse refers to it as a kind of strewing roses or strewing flowers, unpetaling roses. Those are like the little gifts that we have. But in the end, the realization that our works are nothing. Mm-hmm. But we do all we can. But at the end of the day, it's nothing, and it's God who does it all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the impetus of love to love. Mm-hmm. It's kind of one leads into the other. So it's God works on His own terms and through grace and His providence, but by the sheer fact of dwelling within us and loving us from inside, there's this impetus that moves us to love others as well.
But almost doing it in a kind of detached way, right? As a little child, so you don't think of like what I'm doing, like, oh, this is so important, or I wish I could do this better, or oh, I messed that up a lot, like just because you're not so focused on the work itself, but doing what you do, through love and just trying your best just to give yourself to God in whatever way that might look like, and the works are so important, but you're not kind of clinging to the work in and of itself. Right. Like what the work is right. Not the most important thing.
Yeah, this sense of like, well, I started this project, and therefore it has to come to completion, and I'm going to will myself to be this person in my friend group, in my family, at work, mm-hmm. and so it just becomes almost a burden of something that maybe we're not even being called to. Yes. It's our own sort of wishful thinking, yeah. Right? Rather than what actually God has put inside of us to affect in the world.
You're speaking a little close to home to me right now. This is what I need to hear. But it's so true. It's so true, and I think we all have that. We get very caught up in that aspect of our work, And I like this little quote of hers where she talks about it, because she says, "I have no other means of proving my love for you other than that of strewing flowers. That is, not allowing one little sacrifice to escape, not one look, one word, profiting by all the smallest things and doing them through love." And so you get the sense that, what she's doing is not so important, but how she's doing it. But when you really look at this, you're like, wow, this is a high call, to not let one sacrifice escape, one little word or look, profiting by the smallest things. So it's how much energy, in a sense, it takes to live this, I think you can get through this, and yet at the same time, it's very freeing, because it doesn't matter in a way what you're doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that really combats what we were saying, is this misconception about the little way of it being almost just almost like, well, I don't have to do anything, God loves me, and I just trust in that. And it's like, no, Thérèse is very intense, every look, every word, like nothing can pass by. And I think I remember reading as Thérèse continued to grow in holiness, she became more and more aware of her own imperfections still. And so externally, those who knew her wouldn't have even seen any of these things, but there was just these interior ways that she was becoming more aware of those. And it's because of those, she was realizing like the little ways that she would perhaps, not participate in a moment when she could offer a sacrifice. And we can become more aware of those things, but that doesn't cause us to be discouraged, but rather to like really trust and rely on God to work.
Yes. Yeah, because there's no scrupulosity in that. There's no anxiety per se. Right. It's like, even she would say at the end of her life, I'm so happy to find myself weak and imperfect, because that means I'm in such need of God's mercy.
Right.
So it's, again, that kind of tension, you know? I need to do everything through love, but then when I see that I'm failing, all the more do I just trust that God will do it, you know?
And it's freeing in the sense too, because it keeps the individual from staying too much in failure and what missed opportunities that I have today. Yeah. Of course we seek forgiveness, but for those missed opportunities, but it's a constant pushing forward from that realization that I could have done better, that tomorrow I will take the opportunity and be more intentional about the gifts and graces that God's giving me and the opportunities that He's giving me as well to love Him and love others. So rather than focusing on missed opportunities, it's a focus on God's mercy that He's helping us to grow. It's a process of purification from day to day.
And Thérèse has a lot of images that she uses when talking about the little way, and that reminds me of even the beginnings of the little way was this idea of Jesus lifting up a child like onto his lap. And so we make ourselves little, we realize our littleness not for the sake of staying in that smallness, like it's staying down, but it's so that then Jesus picks us up. Or the image of the elevator, which is another big one. It's not, we recognize our smallness so that we can be lifted up.
Yeah.
Not to just remain in it, dwell in it.
Exactly. And I think that's another key part of the attitude is there's like a lack almost of self-consciousness so much where you're not so caught up in how small I am or what I'm doing or where am I growing in virtue or not growing in virtue. It's a real kind of just trying to take that vision off yourself and put it onto God. And it's like, I am small and I'm poor, but God knows what He's doing, and I might never see it either, and I have to be at peace with that. Like I may never see the fruits of holiness, at least in this life, that He's working in me, but I trust, that He's the one that's going to lift me up. He's the one doing it.
I have to share I love the image of the elevator. It's one of my favorite images of Thérèse that she provides in Story of a Soul. And I know that it's a loved passage for a lot of people. In 2 of our monasteries, we have at the top floor of where the elevator stops. There's in both monasteries there's a statue of Saint Thérèse. As the doors open, you have Saint Thérèse looking at you, and this idea that we have a friar, in fact, who calls the elevator the arms of God. Yeah.
Well, especially at one of our monasteries at Holy Hill in Wisconsin, there's 7 different floors. So. Right. Especially if we have lived with a lot of men who are in their 70s or 80s, and they learn to really appreciate that elevator because walking up that many steps would not be possible for them. So they have a real sense of what Therése's little way is.
And of course, our choir, our chapel where we have mass and office is on the top floor.
Right.
Yeah. So, Jesus is taking you up there.
Sometimes some mornings you just need that elevator to get you to mass.
Yeah.
So where did Thérèse then, where did that image come from, I guess?
Mm-hmm. Well, it might be worth reading this quote kind of where she talks about the origin of the little way, but kind of sums it all up, and it might be a good way to conclude, to hear just from her and how she describes these images. So this is what she says. And this is from the Story of a Soul, of course. Mother, I have always wanted to be a saint. Alas, I have always noticed that when I compared myself to the saints, there is between them and me the same difference that exists between a mountain whose summit is lost in the clouds and the obscure grain of sand trampled underfoot by passers-by. Instead of becoming discouraged, I say to myself, God cannot inspire unrealizable desires. I can, then, in spite of my littleness, aspire to holiness. It is impossible for me to grow up, so I must bear with myself such as I am with all my imperfections. But I want to seek out a means of going to heaven by a little way, a way that is very straight, very short, and totally new. We are living now in an age of inventions, and we no longer have to take the trouble of climbing stairs, for in the homes of the rich, an elevator has replaced those very successfully. I wanted to find an elevator which would raise me up to Jesus, for I'm too small to climb the rough stairway of perfection. I searched then in the scriptures for some sign of this elevator, the object of my desires, and I read these words coming from the mouth of eternal wisdom. Whoever is a little one, let him come to me. And so I succeeded. I felt I had found what I was looking for. But wanting to know, oh my God, what you would do to the very little one who answered your call, I continued my search, and this is what I discovered. As one whom a mother caresses, so will I comfort you. You shall be carried at the breasts, and upon the knees they shall caress you. Ah, never did words more tender and more melodious come to give joy to my soul. The elevator which must raise me to heaven is your arms, O Jesus. And for this I had no need to grow up, but rather I had to remain little and become this more and more.
Yeah, wow, what a beautiful passage of the reliance, of our reliance, our need to rely solely on God and in His grace amidst so much of our own weaknesses and littleness, that this is exactly what God is looking for us to realize, that we need Him in all things. And so what a blessing this episode has been. I hope that our viewers and listeners have enjoyed it as well. And so we'll continue next week with more on St. Thérèse. So we thank you for joining us. We hope you have a blessed, I think we're in the third week of Lent now, as this is airing. So a blessed third week of Lent. We're halfway through this spiritual season. So we'll be praying for each other in this endeavor, that we grow closer to God, and a greater reliance on His grace and mercy. God bless you. Hey everyone, Brother Pier Giorgio here. Thanks for checking out this episode of CarmelCast. If you want to hear more of us, don't forget to click subscribe. Also, be sure to click like if you enjoyed this episode, and maybe even leave us a comment. We post discussion questions down below to get the conversation going. Want more information on Carmelite spirituality and the Discalced Carmelite Saints? Then you'll want to check out our website, www.icspublications.org. There's a link in the description of this episode. From here, you can see all our current promotions and access our complete catalog for the writings of St. John of the Cross, St. Teresa of Avila, St. Thérèse of Lisieux, St. Elizabeth of the Trinity, and St. Edith Stein. If you want to stay up to date on all our promotions and new titles, then be sure to add your email to our email list. There's no better way to stay up to date on the latest Carmelite publications. Thanks for joining us, and may God bless you.